The Texas sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Jake Sullivan rode the dusty trail between Amarillo and the Mexican border, his bay gelding's hooves kicking up small clouds of red dirt with each weary step. August of 1882 had brought one of the harshest summers in memory, and even the hardy mesquite bushes that dotted the landscape seemed to wilt under the relentless heat. Jake pulled his sweat-stained hat lower over his eyes, squinting against the glare that shimmered off the hardpan like water. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following leads about stolen cattle that had taken him far from his ranch near Fort Worth. The trail had gone cold near Sweetwater, leaving him with nothing to show for his efforts except sunburned skin and a horse that needed rest more than he could afford to give. But Jake Sullivan was nothing if not persistent, a quality that had served him well during his years as a Texas Ranger and now as a rancher, trying to build something lasting from the unforgiving land. As he crested a low rise, movement in the distance caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be another mirage. The heat had been playing tricks on his eyes all day, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something that made him urge his horse into a reluctant trot, despite the animal's obvious exhaustion. A covered wagon sat motionless beside the trail, its canvas top bleached white by sun and weather. The 2 oxen that should have been pulling it were nowhere to be seen, and there was an ominous stillness about the scene that set Jake's nerves on edge. In this part of Texas, abandoned wagons usually meant trouble, either Indian raids, bandits, or simply the harsh reality of frontier life claiming another victim. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape for any sign of danger. The silence was absolute except for the whisper of wind through the sparse grass and the rhythmic creaking of his saddle leather. Even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed muted, as if the very air were holding its breath. As he drew alongside the wagon, Jake could see that its wooden sides were weathered but intact, with no obvious signs of violence. The canvas cover was tied securely, and everything about the setup suggested that whoever had been traveling in it had simply stopped to rest rather than abandoned it in panic. But the absence of the oxen was troubling. No traveler would voluntarily unhitch their animals unless they planned to stay put for an extended period. "Hello, the wagon," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Anyone there?" The silence stretched for several heartbeats, and Jake was beginning to think the wagon was truly abandoned when a sound from within made him freeze. It was soft, barely audible, the kind of sound a person might make when trying to stay quiet but unable to completely suppress their breathing. "Ma'am?" Jake tried again, his tone gentler this time. "I'm not looking for trouble. Just saw your wagon and wanted to make sure you're all right." This time, the response was immediate. A sharp intake of breath followed by what sounded like someone moving carefully inside the covered space. Jake could hear the rustle of fabric and the soft creak of wooden floorboards under shifting weight. "Please," came a voice from within the wagon, female, young, and edged with exhaustion and fear. "I don't have anything worth stealing. Just leave me be." Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberately non-threatening. "Ma'am, I'm not here to rob you. Name's Jake Sullivan, and I've got a ranch up near Fort Worth. Saw your wagon sitting here and got worried. This isn't exactly safe country for a woman traveling alone." A long pause followed, during which Jake could almost feel the woman inside weighing her options. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier but still wary. "My oxen wandered off during the night. I've been waiting for them to come back, but—" The sentence trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the hot air. "How long have you been here?" Jake asked, moving closer to the wagon but stopping several feet away to avoid seeming threatening. 3 days, came the quiet reply. "Maybe 4. I've lost track." Jake felt his stomach tighten with concern. 3 or 4 days without water in this heat could be fatal, and the fact that the woman was still coherent enough to carry on a conversation suggested she was either tougher than most or running on reserves that wouldn't last much longer. "Ma'am, I've got water and food, and my horse can carry double if need be. Why don't you come out so we can talk proper? I give you my word as a gentleman that I mean you no harm." Another long silence followed, and Jake was beginning to wonder if the woman had lost consciousness when the canvas flap at the back of the wagon moved slightly. A pale hand emerged first, pushing the fabric aside, followed by the most beautiful face Jake had ever seen. Even exhausted and dusty from days in the wagon, the woman possessed a delicate beauty that seemed almost out of place in the harsh landscape. Her hair was the color of honey in sunlight, braided back but with wisps escaping to frame her face. Her eyes were the deep blue of a Texas sky just before dawn, and they studied Jake with a mixture of desperation and stubborn pride that reminded him of a cornered wild animal. But what struck Jake most powerfully was how young she looked, hardly more than 18 or 19, with the kind of innocence that suggested she had never imagined finding herself in such dire circumstances. And there was something else, something about the careful way she moved and the protective gesture she made with her hands, that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. She was with child. The woman who emerged from the wagon moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve every ounce of strength. Her dress, once probably a cheerful blue gingham, was now faded and stained with dust and perspiration. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of good breeding and inner strength. "I'm Elizabeth Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of educated Southern society. "And before you ask, yes, I am in a delicate condition, and no, I don't have a husband traveling with me." Jake touched the brim of his hat respectfully, noting the defensive edge in her tone. "Ma'am, I wasn't going to ask about your personal circumstances. Right now, my main concern is getting you somewhere safe before this heat does you serious harm." Elizabeth studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his concern was genuine or merely polite. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her slightly, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Sullivan, but I can't simply abandon my wagon. Everything I own is in there, and I have to reach San Antonio. There's someone there who needs to know about." She gestured vaguely toward her stomach, then looked away as if embarrassed by her own circumstances. Jake glanced at the wagon, taking in its practical construction and the quality of the hardware. "This is a good wagon, ma'am, and I can see you've got it loaded with care. But those oxen of yours, they didn't just wander off. Something spooked them, and in this country, that usually means predators or Indians. Either way, they're probably 20 miles from here by now." Elizabeth's face went pale at this assessment, and Jake immediately regretted being so blunt. However, he continued quickly, "I know this area pretty well, and there's a trading post about 15 miles south of here. Fellow name of Murphy, runs it, decent man who doesn't ask too many questions. He might be able to help you get new animals and continue your journey." 15 miles, Elizabeth repeated, looking at the shimmering heat waves rising from the trail. "In this sun. We'll travel at night," Jake said decisively. "Start after sunset, rest during the heat of the day. I've got enough water for both of us if we're careful, and my horse can carry you when walking gets too difficult." Elizabeth looked at him with surprise, as if kindness from a stranger was the last thing she had expected to encounter in this desolate place. "Mr. Sullivan, you don't know anything about me. I could be running from the law, or worse. Why would you risk helping me?" Jake considered the question, his mind briefly touching on memories of other women he had known, some good, some not so good, but all of them human beings, deserving of basic decency. "Ma'am, I reckon a person's past is their own business, unless it directly threatens someone else. What I see here is a woman in trouble who needs help, and I was raised to believe that when you can help, you should." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, a distant howl echoed across the landscape, the unmistakable sound of coyotes beginning their evening hunt. Elizabeth shivered despite the heat, and Jake saw her hand move protectively to her stomach. "All right," she said quietly. "I accept your help, but I insist on paying you for your trouble once we reach the trading post." "We'll discuss that later," Jake replied, already beginning to formulate a plan for the journey ahead. "Right now, let's get you some water and figure out what you absolutely need to bring with you. The rest will have to stay with the wagon until we can arrange proper transport." Over the next hour, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jake helped Elizabeth sort through her possessions. Most of what she carried were the typical belongings of a woman making a long journey: clothes, cooking utensils, a few books, and personal items that spoke of a life that had been comfortable before whatever circumstances had driven her to this desperate flight. But there were other things too, items that made Jake's eyebrows rise slightly. A man's pocket watch, engraved with initials that weren't her own. A photograph of a young man in cavalry uniform, his face bearing the kind of serious expression common to formal portraits, but his eyes holding a warmth that suggested laughter came easily to him. And, most intriguingly, a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents that Elizabeth quickly closed when she saw Jake notice them. "That's private," she said firmly, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied without pressing the issue. But he filed the observation away, along with a growing sense that Elizabeth Morrison's story was more complicated than a simple case of a woman in trouble. As they prepared for the night journey, Jake found himself studying Elizabeth more carefully. Despite her exhaustion and obvious distress, there was something about her that suggested strength and determination. The way she organized her remaining possessions with military precision, the careful way she conserved water without being asked, and the quiet dignity with which she faced their uncertain situation, all spoke of someone who had faced hardship before and emerged stronger for it. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake said as they finished loading his saddlebags with essentials, "if you don't mind my asking, what's waiting for you in San Antonio that's so important you'd risk this journey alone?" Elizabeth paused in her packing, her hands stilling on the fabric of a baby's quilt she had been folding. For a moment, Jake thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "A promise," she said simply. "I made a promise, and I intend to keep it, no matter what it costs me." Jake nodded, recognizing the tone of someone who had made up their mind about something important. He had heard that same inflection in his own voice often enough to know that pressing for details would be pointless. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake helped Elizabeth down from the wagon for what might be the last time. The temperature was already beginning to drop, providing blessed relief from the day's brutal heat. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm for support. Elizabeth looked back at the wagon that had been her home for weeks, then at the vast expanse of Texas wilderness that stretched ahead of them. "Ready," she said firmly, and together they set off into the night, two strangers bound together by circumstance and the simple human need to help one another survive. The night journey to Murphy's trading post became a testament to human endurance and the power of shared determination. Jake set a steady pace, mindful of Elizabeth's condition but aware that they needed to cover as much ground as possible before the sun made travel unbearable again. The moon, nearly full, provided enough light to navigate by, casting the landscape in silver and shadow. For the first few hours, Elizabeth walked beside Jake's horse with remarkable fortitude, her jaw set with determination that reminded him of soldiers he had known during his ranger days. But as the night wore on, and the accumulated exhaustion of her ordeal began to take its toll, Jake insisted she ride while he walked alongside, leading his mount by the reins. "I can walk further," Elizabeth protested when Jake stopped to help her into the saddle. "I don't want to be a burden." "Ma'am, you're carrying precious cargo," Jake replied gently, his meaning clear. "And besides, my horse could use the practice carrying a lady." Most of his passengers have been considerably less refined. Despite her weariness, Elizabeth managed a small smile at this. "You're very kind, Mr. Sullivan. I hope someday I can repay your generosity." As they continued through the night, conversation came in fits and starts. Elizabeth seemed reluctant to discuss her past or her reasons for traveling to San Antonio, but she showed genuine interest in Jake's stories about his ranch and his years as a Texas Ranger. Jake, for his part, found himself more curious about this mysterious woman with each passing hour, but he respected her privacy and didn't press for information she wasn't ready to share. It was during one of their rest stops, as they shared water and hardtack beneath a stand of mesquite trees, that Elizabeth finally began to open up about her circumstances. "The man in the photograph you saw," she said suddenly, staring out at the moonlit landscape. "His name was Daniel Morrison. He was my husband." Jake waited quietly, sensing that more was coming. "Daniel was a lieutenant in the 7th Cavalry," Elizabeth continued, her voice steady but distant. "He was killed at Little Bighorn, along with General Custer and all the rest. I didn't learn about it until months later, when I was already—" She gestured toward her stomach. "I'm sorry," Jake said simply, meaning it. He had known many good men who had died in uniform, and he understood the particular weight of grief that came with such losses. "Daniel and I had only been married 6 months when he was deployed," Elizabeth went on. "But before he left, he made me promise something. He said if anything happened to him, I should take our child to San Antonio, to his best friend from West Point, a man named Captain James Mitchell." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach at the mention of that name, but he kept his expression neutral. "Captain Mitchell?" "Yes. Daniel said James would take care of us, that he had promised to look after Daniel's family if something happened. Daniel was very specific about it. He made me swear I would find James if I was ever in trouble. The silence that followed this revelation stretched uncomfortably long. Elizabeth looked at Jake with growing concern, noting the change in his expression. "Mr. Sullivan? Do you know Captain Mitchell?" Jake stared out at the horizon, his mind reeling with the implications of what Elizabeth had just told him. James Mitchell, his best friend, his partner through countless adventures and dangers, the man who had saved his life more times than he could count, had been dead for 2 months. "Ma'am," Jake said carefully, "I need to tell you something about Captain Mitchell, but maybe we should wait until we reach Murphy's place. It's been a long night, and..." Elizabeth's voice was firm, with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "Tell me now. Whatever it is, I need to know." Jake took a deep breath, searching for words that might soften the blow he was about to deliver. "Mrs. Morrison, I knew James Mitchell. We served together in the Rangers for 3 years, and we stayed in touch after he went back to the regular army. He was the best man I ever knew." Elizabeth's face went pale in the moonlight. James died 6 weeks ago," Jake said gently. "Fever took him while he was stationed at Fort Clark. I was at his funeral." The sound Elizabeth made was barely human, a low keening that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She doubled over as if she had been physically struck, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle the cry of despair that threatened to escape. Jake immediately moved to her side, offering what comfort he could while respecting her need to process this devastating news. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm so sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." "He's dead," Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "Daniel's dead, James is dead, and I'm..." She looked down at her swollen belly, then back at Jake with eyes that held a kind of lost desperation he had seen in the faces of people who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. "You're alive," Jake said firmly, "and so is your child. And as long as that's true, there's still hope." Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Hope? Mr. Sullivan, I have no family. Daniel was an orphan, and my parents disowned me when I married a soldier against their wishes. I have no money except what little Daniel left me, which won't last much longer, and now the one person Daniel trusted to help us is dead. What exactly am I supposed to hope for?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, turning over possibilities in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that seemed to surprise even him. "You're going to hope that sometimes, when God closes one door, he opens another. James Mitchell was the best friend I ever had, and if he made a promise to your husband, then by extension, he made a promise to me. I may not be a cavalry captain, but I've got a good ranch, a decent reputation, and enough resources to help a lady and her child get started in a new life." Elizabeth stared at him in shock. "Mr. Sullivan, you can't possibly mean..." "I mean exactly what I said," Jake interrupted. "You came to Texas looking for help from James Mitchell, and you found me instead. Maybe that's not such a bad trade after all." Dawn was breaking over the horizon when Murphy's trading post finally came into view, a cluster of weathered buildings that seemed to emerge from the landscape itself like a mirage made real. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main building, and Jake could see horses in the corral and the reassuring bustle of early morning activity. Patrick Murphy himself emerged from the store as they approached, his red hair and beard unmistakable even at a distance. A man in his 50s who had come to Texas from Ireland via New York and a dozen other places. Murphy had the kind of practical wisdom that came from dealing with every type of person the frontier could produce. "Jake Sullivan," Murphy called out in his thick brogue, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "What brings you so far south, and in such interesting company?" Jake helped Elizabeth down from his horse, noting how she swayed slightly with exhaustion despite her efforts to appear strong. "Patrick, this is Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison. She's had some troubles on the trail, and I was hoping you might be able to help." Murphy's experienced eye took in Elizabeth's condition and circumstances with the quick assessment of a man who had seen every variety of human predicament. "Mrs. Morrison, welcome to my humble establishment. You look like you could use some hot food and a soft bed." "That's very kind," Elizabeth replied, her voice hoarse from the night's journey. "But I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Murphy interrupted with a wave of his hand. "Any friend of Jake's is welcome here, and besides, it's been weeks since I've had the pleasure of civilized conversation." My wife Colleen will be delighted to have another woman to talk to." As if summoned by her name, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying hair appeared in the doorway of the trading post. Colleen Murphy had the sort of maternal presence that immediately made people feel safe and cared for, and Elizabeth visibly relaxed at the sight of her. "Saints preserve us," Colleen exclaimed, hurrying forward to take Elizabeth's arm. "Look at you, poor dear. Come inside this instant and let me get some food into you." As Colleen led Elizabeth toward the building, Jake caught Murphy's eye and nodded toward the corral. The two men had known each other long enough to communicate without words, and Murphy understood that Jake needed to speak privately. "So," Murphy said once they were out of earshot, "what's the real story?" Jake summarized Elizabeth's situation as succinctly as possible, including her connection to Daniel Morrison and James Mitchell. Murphy listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "James Mitchell," Murphy mused when Jake finished. "I remember him, good man, fair dealer. Terrible shame about the fever. But Jake, you realize what you're taking on here? A pregnant widow with no family and no resources? That's a considerable responsibility." "I know," Jake replied. "But Patrick, James was the best friend I ever had. He saved my life more times than I can count, and I never got the chance to return the favor. If helping his friend's widow is the closest I can come to repaying that debt, then that's what I'll do." Murphy nodded slowly, understanding the code of loyalty that governed men like Jake. "And what does the lady think of your generous offer?" "She hasn't really had time to consider it properly," Jake admitted. "The news about James hit her pretty hard. But she's got nowhere else to go, and winter's coming on. She can't travel in her condition, and she sure can't survive on her own." Over the next several hours, as Elizabeth rested and recovered her strength, Jake found himself thinking more seriously about the implications of his impulsive offer. His ranch was successful enough to support additional people, but taking in a pregnant woman meant accepting responsibility not just for her welfare but for her child's future. It meant gossip and speculation from neighbors, potential complications with his own plans for marriage and family, and the challenge of helping someone build a new life from nothing. But every time Jake wavered in his resolve, he thought about James Mitchell, about the countless times his friend had risked his own safety for others, about the kind of man who would make a promise to a dying comrade and mean it absolutely. If James had been alive, he would have moved heaven and earth to help Elizabeth and her child. The least Jake could do was try to live up to that standard. It was late afternoon when Elizabeth finally emerged from the room where she had been resting. Colleen had provided her with clean clothes and the opportunity to wash properly, and the transformation was remarkable. With her honey-colored hair neatly braided and her face no longer gray with exhaustion, Elizabeth looked more like the young woman she was and less like a refugee from disaster. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake said, rising from the chair where he had been waiting. "You look much better." "I feel much better, thanks to Mrs. Murphy's kindness," Elizabeth replied. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been thinking about what you said last night, and I don't know how to respond to such generosity." "You don't need to respond right now," Jake said gently. "But I want you to understand that my offer was sincere. I've got a good ranch with a solid house, and there's plenty of room for you and your child. You'd have your own quarters, complete privacy, and no expectations except that you allow me to help you get back on your feet." Elizabeth studied his face carefully, as if trying to read his true motivations. "Mr. Sullivan, you're asking me to trust you with my life and my child's future. That's an enormous leap of faith for someone I've known for less than 2 days." "Yes, ma'am, it is," Jake acknowledged. "But sometimes that's all we've got, faith and the hope that most people are better than their worst impulses." Murphy, who had been listening from behind the store counter, spoke up unexpectedly. "Mrs. Morrison, if I might offer an opinion, I've known Jake Sullivan for 5 years, and I've never met a more honorable man. If he gives you his word, you can trust it absolutely." Colleen Murphy nodded her agreement. That man would walk through fire before he'd break a promise or harm someone under his protection. You couldn't ask for a better guardian for yourself and your child. Elizabeth looked around at these people who barely knew her but were willing to vouch for a stranger's character. "And what happens when the baby comes? What happens when people start asking questions about who I am and why I'm living on your ranch?" Jake had been dreading this question, but he answered it honestly. "People will talk, that's certain. Some will assume the worst, others will mind their own business. But Mrs. Morrison, I've learned that you can't live your life based on what other people think. You do what's right, and you let the rest sort itself out." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Jake to wonder if he had pushed too hard, offered too much too quickly. Then Elizabeth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Sullivan, if you're truly serious about this offer, then I accept. I don't have any other choices, and I can't raise a child on the prairie with nothing but hope and stubbornness." The relief Jake felt was so profound it surprised him. "You won't regret this decision, Mrs. Morrison. I give you my word." "There is one thing," Elizabeth said, her cheeks coloring slightly. "If I'm going to be living on your ranch, even temporarily, people are going to make assumptions about the nature of our arrangement. I want you to know that I'm not looking for a husband, Mr. Sullivan. I'm still in mourning for Daniel, and I may always be." Jake nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm offering you sanctuary, not marriage. Whatever decisions you make about your future will be entirely your own." As the sun set over the Texas plains, Jake found himself contemplating the dramatic turn his life had taken in the span of a single day. This morning he had been a bachelor rancher with simple goals and straightforward problems. Tonight he was responsible for a pregnant widow and her unborn child, committed to a course of action that would change everything about his carefully ordered existence. But as he watched Elizabeth sitting by the window, her hand resting protectively on her stomach while she gazed out at the vast landscape that would soon be her new home, Jake felt a sense of rightness about his decision that went deeper than logic or reason. James Mitchell had always said that a man's character was defined not by what he did for himself, but by what he did for others when there was nothing in it for him. Perhaps this was Jake's chance to finally live up to the example his best friend had set. The journey from Murphy's trading post to Jake's ranch took 3 days of careful travel, with frequent stops to accommodate Elizabeth's condition and the additional supplies Murphy had insisted they take. Jake had purchased a gentle mare for Elizabeth to ride, along with a pack mule to carry the essentials she would need to establish herself in her new home. As they traveled north through the rolling hills of central Texas, Elizabeth found herself studying her unexpected benefactor with growing curiosity. Jake Sullivan was not what she had expected when she first heard his voice outside her wagon. He was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work. His brown hair was perpetually tousled by wind and hat, and his gray eyes held a depth of experience that suggested he had seen both the best and worst that life could offer. But what struck Elizabeth most about Jake was his quiet competence. He moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to handle whatever challenges arose, yet he treated her with a gentle consideration that spoke of genuine respect for her situation. He never made her feel like a burden or an obligation, despite the obvious complications her presence brought to his life. On their second evening of travel, as they made camp beside a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, Elizabeth finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been troubling her since leaving the trading post. "Mr. Sullivan," she said as they sat by their small fire, the flames dancing in the darkness, "why are you really doing this? And please don't tell me it's just because of your friendship with Captain Mitchell. There's something more, isn't there?" Jake was quiet for so long that Elizabeth began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that made her understand she was hearing something important. "I had a sister once," he said, staring into the fire. "Mary. She was 2 years younger than me, and after our parents died, she was all the family I had left. When she was 18, she fell in love with a cowboy who worked on a neighboring ranch. Good man. Or so I thought. They got married despite my reservations, and for a while, everything seemed fine." Jake paused to poke at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky. Then the drought of 2077 hit, and work became scarce. Mary's husband took a job driving cattle to Kansas, promising he'd send for her once he got established. The last letter she got from him was postmarked Dodge City. After that, nothing. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to ache as she sensed where this story was heading. "Mary waited 2 years, Jake continued. 2 years of making excuses for why he hadn't written, why he hadn't come back, why he hadn't sent for her. She was pregnant by then, had been when he left, though she didn't know it at the time. When the baby came, she was all alone except for me, and I was off playing Texas Ranger, thinking I was doing important work." "What happened?" Elizabeth asked gently. "She died giving birth," Jake said simply. "Baby died too. If I had been there, if I had insisted she come stay with me instead of waiting in that little cabin for a man who was never coming back, maybe things would have been different." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of the fire crackling and the distant call of a night bird. Elizabeth felt tears stinging her eyes as she understood the true depth of Jake's motivation in helping her. "Mr. Sullivan, you can't blame yourself for, can't I?" Jake looked up from the fire, his eyes reflecting pain that time hadn't entirely healed. "Mrs. Morrison, I learned that night that when someone needs help, you help them. You don't wait for a more convenient time. You don't worry about what other people will think, and you sure don't assume someone else will step in to do what you should do yourself." Elizabeth reached across the space between them to touch his hand briefly. "I'm sorry about your sister, and I'm grateful that her memory led you to help me. But Jake, may I call you Jake? You have to know that what happened to Mary wasn't your fault." Jake managed a small smile at her use of his first name. "Maybe not. But what happens to you and your child, that's something I can control, and I intend to make sure the outcome is different this time." The next morning brought their first glimpse of Jake's ranch as they crested a hill that overlooked a broad valley. Elizabeth gasped at the sight that spread before them, a prosperous-looking spread with a substantial two-story house, several outbuildings, and hundreds of cattle grazing in fenced pastures that stretched to the horizon. "This is your ranch?" she asked, unable to keep the amazement out of her voice. "Home sweet home," Jake replied, pride evident in his tone. "Built most of it myself, though I had help with the big jobs. It's not fancy, but it's solid and comfortable." As they approached the house, Elizabeth could see the care that had gone into its construction. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking was fresh and tight, and the wide front porch promised cool shade during the brutal Texas summers. Flower beds flanked the front steps, though they showed signs of neglect that suggested the absence of a woman's touch. "Jake!" a voice called from the direction of the barn, and Elizabeth saw a man emerge from the shadows, moving with the bow-legged gait of someone who had spent his life on horseback. He was older than Jake, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of deeply tanned face that spoke of decades under the Texas sun. "Walt," Jake called back, dismounting and moving to help Elizabeth down from her horse. "This is Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison. She'll be staying with us for a while." Walt removed his hat politely, revealing a completely bald head that gleamed in the sunlight. "Mom, welcome to the Flying S. I'm Walt Patterson, foreman of this here operation." Elizabeth liked him immediately. There was something about Walt's manner, respectful but not obsequious, curious but not intrusive, that made her feel comfortable. "Mrs. Morrison has had some troubles on the trail," Jake explained. "She'll be taking the room at the back of the house, and I want you to make sure all the boys know she's to be treated with complete respect." "Course," Walt replied, as if the instruction were unnecessary. "Ma'am, if you need anything at all, you just let me know. We ain't used to having a lady around, but we'll do our best to make you comfortable." As Jake led her toward the house, Elizabeth marveled at the transformation her life had undergone in such a short time. A week ago, she had been alone and desperate, facing an uncertain future with nothing but her determination to honor her dead husband's wishes. Now she was standing on the porch of a prosperous ranch, surrounded by people who had accepted her presence without question or judgment. The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior. The main room was large and comfortable, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and furniture that was clearly well made and cared for. Everything was clean and orderly, but there was a masculine quality to the space that spoke of a man living alone. "Your room is back here," Jake said, leading her down a short hallway to a door at the rear of the house. "It's got its own entrance to the back porch, so you'll have complete privacy. And there's a pump outside the kitchen door so you won't have to go far for water." The room Jake showed her was simple but comfortable, with a large bed, a dresser, a rocking chair by the window, and enough space for all her belongings. Clean white curtains hung at the windows, and someone had placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the dresser. "It's perfect," Elizabeth said, and meant it. "Jake, I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to thank me," Jake replied. "Just focus on staying healthy and taking care of yourself and the baby. Everything else will work itself out." Over the following weeks, Elizabeth gradually settled into life at the Flying S Ranch. The routine was simple but comforting. She helped with cooking and household tasks when her energy permitted, spent long hours reading in the shade of the front porch, and took gentle walks around the immediate ranch area to maintain her strength. The ranch hands, initially awkward around their unexpected female guest, quickly warmed to Elizabeth's gentle manner and genuine interest in their work. She proved to have a natural talent for tending minor injuries and ailments, knowledge she had gained from helping her mother care for sick neighbors back in Virginia. Soon, cowboys were appearing at the kitchen door with everything from rope burns to infected cuts, trusting her ministrations more than their own rough-and-ready remedies. Jake watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. Elizabeth was clearly more comfortable when she felt useful, and her presence was bringing a civilizing influence to the ranch that he hadn't realized was missing. The men cleaned up their language around her, took more care with their appearance, and seemed to take extra pride in their work when she complimented their efforts. But as Elizabeth's pregnancy advanced and her time drew near, Jake found himself facing complications he hadn't anticipated. October brought cooler weather and the beginning of what promised to be a harsh winter. Elizabeth was now in her 8th month, and her condition was becoming more apparent to anyone who might visit the ranch. Jake had managed to deflect most curious questions from neighbors by explaining that Mrs. Morrison was a distant relative who had lost her husband and needed temporary shelter. Most people accepted this explanation without pressing for details, but Jake could see the speculation in their eyes. It was during a visit to town for supplies that Jake encountered the first real challenge to their arrangement. He was loading feed sacks into his wagon when Mayor Hutchins approached with the kind of officious manner that meant trouble. "Jake," Hutchins said with false bonhomie, "good to see you. I hear you've got a house guest these days." "That's right," Jake replied carefully, continuing to load his wagon. "Mrs. Morrison, a relative who needed assistance." "Relative," Hutchins repeated, his tone suggesting disbelief. "Funny thing, I was talking to Bill Henderson yesterday, and he mentioned seeing you with a young woman at Murphy's trading post a few weeks back. Said she looked to be in the family way." Jake straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt before he caught himself. "Mayor, I'm not sure what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Hutchins interrupted smoothly. "Just wondering if this relative of yours is legally married, or if perhaps she's seeking alternative arrangements for her situation." The implication was clear, and Jake felt his temper begin to rise. But before he could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind him. "Gentlemen, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jake turned to see Reverend William Porter approaching, his clerical collar gleaming white against his black shirt. Porter was one of the few men in town whom Jake genuinely respected, a minister who practiced what he preached and never hesitated to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. "Reverend Porter," Mayor Hutchins said, his manner becoming noticeably more deferential. "We were just discussing Jake's house guest." "Ah, yes, Mrs. Morrison," Porter said pleasantly. "A delightful woman. I had the pleasure of meeting her when she attended services last Sunday. Such a tragic story, losing her husband so young, and with a child on the way. It speaks well of your character, Jake, that you've opened your home to someone in such desperate need." Hutchins looked taken aback by the minister's obvious approval of the arrangement. "Well, of course, if the woman is legitimately widowed." "Legitimately widowed?" Porter's voice carried a subtle edge that made both men take notice. "Mayor Hutchins, are you suggesting that a woman's grief must meet some sort of public standard to be considered genuine?" "No, of course not." Hutchins backpedaled quickly. You were merely engaging in the kind of gossip and speculation that does credit to no one," Porter said firmly. "Mrs. Morrison is a respectable woman facing difficult circumstances with remarkable courage. She deserves our support, not our suspicion." After Hutchins departed with obvious discomfort, Porter turned to Jake with a more serious expression. "Walk with me for a moment, would you?" They strolled toward the edge of town, away from curious ears. "Jake," Porter said finally, "I meant what I said about Mrs. Morrison. She's a fine woman, and you're doing a good thing by helping her. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that your current arrangement, complicated." "How so?" "A single man and a pregnant woman living under the same roof, regardless of the innocence of the situation, is bound to generate talk, and that talk could cause problems for both of you, especially once the child is born." Jake had been dreading this conversation, but he knew Porter was right. "What would you suggest, Reverend?" Porter was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Have you considered marriage?" Jake almost choked on his surprise. "Marriage, Reverend? Mrs. Morrison is still in mourning for her husband. She's made it very clear that she has no interest in remarrying." "I'm not talking about a romantic marriage," Porter said gently. "I'm talking about a marriage of convenience, a legal arrangement that would protect both your reputations and provide security for Mrs. Morrison and her child. Such arrangements are more common than you might think, especially on the frontier." The idea was so unexpected that Jake found himself speechless. But that would be... Elizabeth would never. Have you asked her? Porter interrupted. Because I suspect Mrs. Morrison is practical enough to understand the benefits of such an arrangement. She would have a name, legal protection, and security for her child. You would have companionship and someone to help manage your household. And both of you would be free from the kind of speculation and gossip that could make life very unpleasant. As Jake drove back to the ranch, his mind churned with possibilities and complications. The idea of a marriage of convenience had never occurred to him, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. Elizabeth was an intelligent woman who would certainly understand the practical benefits of such an arrangement. But would she accept such a proposal? And more importantly, could he offer it without making her feel like she was being pressured into something she didn't want? He was still wrestling with these questions when he arrived at the ranch to find Elizabeth sitting on the front porch, her face pale and her hands pressed against her stomach. Elizabeth? He hurried up the steps, alarmed by her appearance. What's wrong? I think, she said carefully, that it might be time. The next 12 hours would forever remain burned into Jake's memory as the longest of his life. Dr. Samuel Richards, summoned urgently from town, had taken over Elizabeth's room with the calm efficiency of a man who had delivered hundreds of babies. But as the labor progressed, his expression grew increasingly concerned. The baby's in a breech position, Dr. Richards explained to Jake during one of his brief appearances in the main room. It's going to be a difficult birth, and Mrs. Morrison is already exhausted. I need you to understand that we may not be able to save both of them. Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The possibility that Elizabeth might die had never seriously occurred to him, and the thought of losing her now when he had just begun to realize how much her presence meant to him was almost unbearable. What can I do? He asked. Pray, Dr. Richards replied simply, and be prepared for the worst. Throughout the long night, Jake paced the front room like a caged animal, starting at every sound from Elizabeth's room. Walt and several of the ranch hands maintained a vigil with him, their usual easy banter replaced by the kind of quiet tension that comes when everyone understands that life and death are being decided just beyond a closed door. It was nearly dawn when the sound Jake had been desperately hoping to hear finally came, the thin, angry cry of a newborn baby. He was on his feet instantly, but Dr. Richards emerged from the room before he could move toward it. It's a boy, the doctor said, his face showing exhaustion but also relief. A strong, healthy boy. And Mrs. Morrison came through it better than I expected. She's weak, but she'll recover. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. Can I see her? In a few minutes. Let me get the baby cleaned up and make sure everything's stable. When Jake was finally allowed into Elizabeth's room, he found her propped up against pillows, her face pale but radiant as she held her son. The baby was wrapped in a soft blanket, his tiny face peaceful in sleep, and Jake was struck by how perfectly he fit in his mother's arms. He's beautiful, Jake said softly, pulling a chair close to the bed. Daniel James Morrison, Elizabeth said, her voice hoarse but filled with joy. After his father and Captain Mitchell. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's a fine name. They would both be honored. As the days passed and Elizabeth recovered her strength, the reality of their situation became more pressing. A baby changed everything, not just the dynamics of life at the ranch, but the urgency of providing legal protection for Elizabeth and her son. It was during one of his evening visits to check on Elizabeth and the baby that Jake finally worked up the courage to broach the subject that had been weighing on his mind. Elizabeth, he said carefully, I've been thinking about something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond. She looked up from nursing the baby, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. I had a conversation with Reverend Porter a few weeks ago, Jake continued. He pointed out some complications with our current arrangement, complications that could affect both of us, but especially you and Daniel. What kind of complications? Jake took a deep breath. People are talking. Nothing malicious, mostly, but there's speculation about the nature of our relationship and about Daniel's parentage. That kind of talk could follow you for years, and it could affect Daniel when he gets older. Elizabeth's expression grew guarded. What are you suggesting? A marriage of convenience, Jake said quickly. A legal arrangement that would give you and Daniel protection and legitimacy, while allowing both of us to maintain our independence. We would be married in name, only separate rooms, separate lives in most respects, but united in the eyes of the law and the community. The silence that followed was so long that Jake began to think he had made a terrible mistake. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "That's a very generous offer, Jake. But I have to ask, what would you get out of such an arrangement?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Companionship," he said finally. "Someone to share the responsibilities of running a household, and the satisfaction of knowing that I'd honored the memory of two good men by protecting what they cared about most." Elizabeth studied his face carefully, as if trying to read his true motivations. "And you would expect nothing else from me? Marital obligations? Nothing you weren't willing to give freely," Jake said firmly. "Elizabeth, I'm not trying to trap you or take advantage of your situation. I'm trying to offer you a way to build a secure future for yourself and your son." Another long silence followed, during which Jake could hear his own heartbeat and the soft sounds of the baby settling into sleep. "Could I have time to think about it?" Elizabeth asked finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." But as it turned out, circumstances didn't allow for extended consideration. 2 days later, Walt brought disturbing news from town. "Boss," he said, finding Jake in the barn, "you need to know that there's talk about Mrs. Morrison and the baby. Some folks are saying she's not really a widow, that maybe she came here looking for a man to take responsibility for another man's mistake." Jake felt his temper flare. "That's ridiculous. Elizabeth has documents proving her marriage to Daniel Morrison." "I know that, and you know that," Walt replied. "But documents can be forged, and people believe what they want to believe. There's even talk about getting the territorial authorities involved, having them investigate whether fraud's being committed." That evening, Jake knocked on Elizabeth's door with a heavier heart than he had carried in weeks. When she answered, he could see in her eyes that she had already heard about the growing rumors. "I've made my decision about your proposal," she said before he could speak. "If you're still willing, I would be honored to accept." The wedding took place on a crisp November morning at the small church in town, with only Reverend Porter, Dr. Richards, Walt Patterson, and Colleen Murphy as witnesses. Elizabeth wore a simple blue dress that Colleen had altered to fit properly, and she carried a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Walt had gathered from the prairie. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, with both Jake and Elizabeth speaking their vows in voices that were steady but reserved. To any observer, they might have seemed like a couple going through the motions rather than celebrating a joyous occasion. But Reverend Porter, who had counseled many couples over the years, recognized something deeper in their exchange of promises, a foundation of mutual respect and genuine caring that, while not romantic love, was perhaps more solid than many marriages built on passion alone. After the ceremony, the small group returned to the ranch for a simple reception that Colleen had insisted on organizing. As they shared cake and coffee in the front room of the house, baby Daniel slept peacefully in his mother's arms, blissfully unaware that his legal status had just been secured and his future protected. "To Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Richards said, raising his coffee cup in a toast, "may your marriage bring you both the happiness and security you deserve." As winter settled over the ranch, Jake and Elizabeth gradually established the rhythms of their unusual household. Elizabeth proved to be an excellent housekeeper and cook, transforming the bachelor quarters into a comfortable home with touches that Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing. She made curtains for the windows, planted an herb garden near the kitchen door, and filled the house with the kind of small comforts that made it feel like more than just a place to sleep. For his part, Jake respected Elizabeth's need for privacy and independence while ensuring that she and Daniel wanted for nothing. He built a cradle for the baby from oak wood he had been saving for a special project, and he made sure that Elizabeth had access to books, writing materials, and anything else that might ease the isolation of ranch life. Their relationship remained formal but gradually warmed into something approaching friendship. They ate their meals together, shared the work of running the household, and spent their evenings reading or discussing the day's events. Jake found Elizabeth to be an intelligent conversationalist with well-informed opinions on everything from politics to literature, while Elizabeth appreciated Jake's dry sense of humor and his willingness to listen to her thoughts without dismissing them as mere feminine fancy. But it was their shared devotion to baby Daniel that truly began to forge a bond between them. Jake had never spent much time around infants, but he proved to have a natural talent for fatherhood. He would rock Daniel to sleep when the baby was fussy, tell him stories about the ranch and the animals, and even change diapers with only minimal grumbling about the indignities involved. Elizabeth watched these interactions with wonder and growing affection. Jake had never suggested that Daniel was anything other than her late husband's child, but he treated the boy with the kind of loving attention she would have expected from a biological father. When Daniel began to smile and respond to voices, his brightest grins were invariably reserved for Jake, and Elizabeth could see how much joy the baby brought to her husband's life. It was during one of these quiet domestic scenes that Elizabeth realized her feelings for Jake had begun to evolve beyond mere gratitude. Watching him patiently teach Daniel to grasp objects while making silly faces that delighted the baby, she felt something warm and sweet unfold in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to love. The realization troubled her more than she cared to admit. She had married Jake with the understanding that theirs would be a practical arrangement, free from the complications of romantic attachment. But as the months passed and she witnessed his kindness, his integrity, and his genuine care for both her and Daniel, she found herself wanting more from their marriage than the security and companionship they had originally agreed upon. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a bustle of activity as the ranch prepared for cattle drives and the seasonal work of maintaining a large operation. Elizabeth had recovered completely from childbirth and was helping more with the daily operations, keeping books, managing correspondence, and even assisting with the care of injured animals. It was during the spring roundup that an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch, a man whose presence would force Elizabeth to confront truths about her past that she had been trying to avoid. Captain Robert Thornton of the 7th Cavalry rode up to the house on a warm May afternoon, his military bearing and official demeanor immediately putting Elizabeth on edge. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw him approach, and something about his purposeful manner made her pulse quicken with anxiety. "Mrs. Sullivan," Thornton said, dismounting and removing his hat politely. "I'm Captain Thornton, 7th Cavalry. I was hoping I might have a word with you about your late husband, Lieutenant Daniel Morrison." Elizabeth's hand stilled on the wet sheets she had been hanging. "What about Daniel?" "I'm conducting an investigation into some irregularities in Lieutenant Morrison's service record," Thornton explained. "I was hoping you might be able to help clarify some details about his death and the circumstances surrounding it." Jake appeared from the direction of the barn, having seen the visitor arrive. His expression was carefully neutral, but Elizabeth could see the tension in his shoulders as he approached. "Captain Thornton," Jake said, extending his hand. "I'm Jake Sullivan. Is there some problem?" Thornton shook Jake's hand while studying his face carefully. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your wife was married to Lieutenant Daniel Morrison of the 7th Cavalry, who was reportedly killed at Little Bighorn." "That's correct," Jake replied evenly. "Is there some question about that?" "I'm afraid there is," Thornton said gravely. "You see, gentlemen, according to our records, Lieutenant Daniel Morrison was not killed at Little Bighorn. In fact, Lieutenant Daniel Morrison deserted his post 3 weeks before the battle, along with a substantial amount of Army payroll money. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Elizabeth felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the implications of Thornton's words sank in. If Daniel hadn't died at Little Bighorn, if he had deserted instead, then everything she had believed about her husband, everything she had told Jake, everything she had built her new life upon, was a lie. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she spoke the words, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. The lack of official notification about Daniel's death, the absence of his name from casualty lists she had later seen, the mysterious gap in his letters before the battle. "Mrs. Sullivan," Captain Thornton said gently, "I'm sorry to be the bearer of such disturbing news, but I need to ask, when was the last time you actually heard from your husband?" Elizabeth sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "May of 1876, she said numbly, 2 months before the battle. "But I thought," he said, communication was difficult. Jake moved to stand beside her, his hand coming to rest protectively on her shoulder. "Captain Thornton, what exactly are you investigating?" "We believe Morrison may have fled to Mexico with the stolen payroll," Thornton replied. "We've been tracking his movements, and the trail led us here." "Mrs. Sullivan, did your husband ever mention plans to travel south? Did he send you any money or gifts that seemed unusually generous?" Elizabeth shook her head, still struggling to process this revelation. "No, nothing like that." "Captain, if Daniel didn't die at Little Bighorn, then where is he? Why didn't he come back to me?" The look of pity in Thornton's eyes gave her the answer before he spoke. "Mrs. Sullivan, we believe your husband started a new life in Mexico. Our information suggests he may have taken another wife there." The sound Elizabeth made was barely human, a low keening that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Everything she had believed about her marriage, about Daniel's love for her, about the nobility of his sacrifice, crumbled in an instant. She had been abandoned, not widowed. Betrayed, not tragically bereft. Jake's hand tightened on her shoulder as he addressed Captain Thornton with barely controlled anger. "Captain, I think you've delivered your message. Unless you have official business here, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my wife to process this information in private." Thornton nodded respectfully. "Of course. Mrs. Sullivan, if you remember anything that might help our investigation, please contact me through Fort Clark. And ma'am, I truly am sorry." After Captain Thornton departed, Elizabeth retreated to her room and didn't emerge for 2 days. Jake could hear her moving around inside, occasionally tending to Daniel when he cried, but she refused his offers of food and conversation through the closed door. On the 3rd morning, he found her sitting on the back porch, staring out at the prairie with eyes that seemed to see nothing. "Elizabeth," he said gently, settling into the chair beside her. "We need to talk." She turned to look at him, and Jake was shocked by the change in her appearance. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, and there was a defeated quality to her posture that spoke of someone who had lost faith in everything she had once believed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I brought this into your life. I'm sorry I lied to you, even though I didn't know I was lying. I'm sorry that by marrying me, you've become entangled in a desertion investigation and God knows what other complications." Jake reached over to take her hand, surprised by how cold her fingers were despite the warm morning. "Elizabeth, you didn't lie to me. You told me what you believed to be true based on the information you had. There's a difference, is there?" Elizabeth's voice was bitter in a way Jake had never heard before. "I told you I was a widow. I told you Daniel died heroically at Little Bighorn. I told you he was an honorable man who made a promise to protect me. All of that was false." "No," Jake said firmly. "You told me you had lost your husband, and you had. You told me he was gone from your life, and he was. The circumstances were different than we thought, but the reality of your situation was exactly what you described." Elizabeth pulled her hand away from his, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "Jake, don't you understand? Everything I based my decisions on was wrong. If I had known Daniel was alive, if I had known he had chosen to abandon me, I never would have. I never would have come to Texas. I never would have accepted your help. I never would have married you." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. "And would that have been better? Would it have been better for you to raise Daniel alone with no resources and no support? Would it have been better for him to grow up knowing his father was a deserter and a thief?" "At least it would have been honest," Elizabeth replied. "At least I wouldn't have trapped you in a marriage based on lies." Jake was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with words that refused to arrange themselves properly. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised even him. "Elizabeth, I didn't marry you because I felt sorry for a widow. I married you because you're a strong, intelligent, courageous woman who deserves better than what life has handed her. Learning the truth about Daniel Morrison doesn't change any of that." Elizabeth looked at him with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. "But Jake, the legal complications alone. If Daniel is alive, then technically I was never free to marry you. Our marriage might not even be valid. We'll deal with whatever legal issues arise," Jake said practically. "But Elizabeth, even if Daniel Morrison walked through that door right now, he wouldn't have any claim on you. He abandoned that right when he chose to disappear with stolen money instead of coming home to his wife." Over the following weeks, as the shock of Captain Thornton's revelation gradually faded, Elizabeth began to rebuild her sense of self and purpose. The process was painful and slow, requiring her to examine every memory of her marriage to Daniel and accept that the man she had loved might never have existed except in her imagination. Jake supported her through this difficult period with patient understanding and practical help. He consulted with lawyers about the legal status of their marriage, helped her draft letters to military authorities about Daniel's abandonment, and gradually convinced her that she had nothing to be ashamed of in the choices she had made. But it was baby Daniel who ultimately provided the motivation Elizabeth needed to move forward. Watching her son grow and develop, seeing his innocent trust and unconditional love, reminded her that some things were more important than dwelling on past betrayals. Whether his biological father was a hero or a coward, Daniel Jr. deserved a mother who could give him the security and love he needed to thrive. It was during one of their evening conversations on the front porch that Elizabeth finally worked up the courage to address the question that had been weighing on her mind for months. "Jake," she said, watching him whittle a small wooden horse for Daniel to play with, "do you ever regret marrying me, now that you know the whole truth about my situation?" Jake looked up from his carving, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight. "Elizabeth, I've learned that the truth is often more complicated than it first appears. But no, I don't regret marrying you. Not for a single day. Even though our marriage has brought you nothing but complications." Jake set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Our marriage has brought me a home instead of just a house. It's brought me the joy of watching Daniel grow up. It's brought me the companionship of the most remarkable woman I've ever known. If those things come with complications, then I'll take the complications gladly." Elizabeth felt her breath catch at the sincerity in his voice. "Jake, are you saying? Do you mean?" "I'm saying that what started as a marriage of convenience has become something much more important to me," Jake said quietly. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with my wife, and I hope someday she might consider falling in love with her husband." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. But to Elizabeth, it seemed as profound as the moment when she had first heard her son's cry after birth. Jake was offering her something she had thought lost forever, the chance to be truly loved and cherished by a good man. "Jake," she said softly, "I think that someday has already arrived." 2 years later, on a warm September evening in 1885, the Sullivan Ranch was celebrating the completion of its most successful cattle drive in the operation's history. Cowboys, neighbors, and friends had gathered for a barbecue that Walt Patterson had declared the biggest shindig this side of San Antonio, and the sound of laughter and music filled the air. Elizabeth stood on the front porch, watching her 3-year-old son chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Jake played fiddle with a group of musicians who had assembled near the barn. At nearly 30, she had grown into her role as ranch wife and mother with a confidence that would have amazed the frightened young woman who had first encountered Jake on that dusty trail. The legal complications surrounding her first marriage had eventually been resolved through a combination of military bureaucracy and frontier pragmatism. Daniel Morrison had never been found, but after extensive investigation, the Army had officially declared him a deserter and fugitive, effectively dissolving Elizabeth's first marriage and validating her union with Jake. More importantly, the emotional wounds left by Daniel's betrayal had healed under the patient care of a man who understood that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt carefully and consistently. Jake had never pushed Elizabeth for more than she was ready to give, but he had never stopped demonstrating through his actions that she and Daniel were the most important things in his world. Their marriage had evolved slowly from convenience to companionship to partnership to something deeper and more lasting than either had dared to hope. They had learned to work together in running the ranch, to parent Daniel as a team, and to find in each other the kind of love that was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than just passion. "Mama," Daniel called out, running toward the porch with a firefly cupped carefully in his small hands. "Look what I caught." Elizabeth knelt down to admire her son's prize, marveling as always at how perfectly he combined features from both his biological father and the man who had become his true father in every way that mattered. Daniel had Jake's gray eyes and steady temperament, but he had inherited Elizabeth's quick wit and love of learning. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, helping him release the firefly back into the night. "Now go wash your hands before you have any cake." As Daniel scampered toward the house, Jake appeared at Elizabeth's side, setting down his fiddle and sliding his arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts," he said, following her gaze out toward the horizon where the last traces of sunset were fading into purple twilight. "I was thinking about promises," Elizabeth replied, leaning into his embrace, "about how some promises get broken and others get kept in ways we never expected." Jake understood immediately what she meant. "Daniel made you promise to find James Mitchell if you ever needed help. And I did find him," Elizabeth said softly. "I just didn't recognize him at first." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their guests enjoy the celebration that marked not just a successful business year, but the anniversary of the day Elizabeth had finally stopped thinking of herself as Mrs. Daniel Morrison and truly became Mrs. Jake Sullivan. "Elizabeth," Jake said eventually, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." She looked up at him, noting the slightly nervous quality in his voice. "What is it?" "Walt got a letter from Fort Clark last week. They've officially closed the investigation into Daniel Morrison's desertion." Captain Thornton wanted to thank you for your cooperation and to let you know that the case is considered resolved. Elizabeth nodded, feeling neither surprise nor particular emotion at this news. The ghost of Daniel Morrison had been laid to rest in her heart long ago, replaced by the reality of a life built with a man who had proven worthy of her trust and love. There's more, Jake continued. Thornton mentioned that they found Morrison in Mexico last month. He's been living there under an assumed name, with a Mexican wife and 2 children. He'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison if he ever sets foot in the United States again. Elizabeth considered this information for a moment, then shrugged slightly. I hope he's been happy with his choices. They certainly made mine possible. Jake smiled at her matter-of-fact response. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, someone who could face difficult truths without being destroyed by them, who could find strength in adversity and hope in the most unlikely circumstances. Any regrets? He asked, echoing a conversation they had shared years earlier. Only one, Elizabeth replied, turning in his arms to face him fully. I regret that it took me so long to realize that sometimes the best promises are the ones that evolve as we do. As if to punctuate her words, Daniel came running back onto the porch, his face and hands now clean but his energy undimmed by the day's activities. Papa Jake, he said, using the name he had chosen for the man who had raised him. Will you tell me the story about the wagon lady again? Jake laughed, scooping the boy up into his arms. Which part do you want to hear? The part where you find her sleeping and she's carrying me? Daniel said seriously. And the part where you decide to keep us both? Elizabeth felt her heart overflow with love as she watched Jake settle into his rocking chair with Daniel on his lap, beginning once again the story that had become family legend. But this time, she heard it differently, not as a tale of rescue and obligation, but as the beginning of a love story that had taken years to fully unfold. The cowboy had found her sleeping in that wagon, carrying what she thought was his dead best friend's child. But what Jake had really found was his future, a woman who would challenge him to be better than he thought possible, a child who would teach him the true meaning of fatherhood, and a love that would prove more enduring than any promise made by desperate people in desperate times. As the last of the guests began to drift away and the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as Elizabeth Morrison, the abandoned wife of a deserter and thief. She had become Elizabeth Sullivan, the beloved wife of an honorable man, and the mother of a child who would grow up knowing he was wanted and cherished. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. And if someone had told that frightened young woman in the broken-down wagon that her greatest misfortune would ultimately lead to her greatest happiness, she never would have believed it. But sitting on the porch of her home, listening to her husband tell their son the story of how their family came to be, Elizabeth Sullivan knew that some of the best promises were indeed the ones that kept themselves, even when the people who made them had moved on to other lives and other loyalties. Jake had promised to help her, and he had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. She had promised to trust him with her life and her child's future, and that trust had been rewarded beyond her wildest dreams. And together, they had promised to build something lasting from the ashes of betrayal and loss. As Elizabeth looked out at the thriving ranch, the successful business, and the strong family they had created together, she knew that was one promise that would endure for generations to come. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest adventures began not with a plan or a destination, but with a simple act of kindness offered to a stranger in need. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that kindness would grow into something beautiful enough to last a lifetime.